There have been times in history though where people, either by their own choice or very much against their will, have been separated from others. Whether it was for a long time or by a vast distance, here are 6 of the most isolated people who ever lived. Julian of Norwich. In the Middle Ages, one way for people to show their devotion to God was to become an anchorite. This involved having a room built next to a church where they could literally be walled in. No one could come in or out of anchorite's chamber. Sometimes a rite similar to a funeral service was held as the anchorite was walled in to show they were now dead to the world. The only holes into the outside world were ones that let the anchorite see the altar in the church, receive communion, and bring in food. The food hatch could also allow visitors to speak to the imprisoned person within. In 1413, Julian was visited by another religious woman, Marjorie Kemp. Then she was charged by our Lord to go to an anchoress in the same city who was called Dame Julian. And so she did, and many wonderful revelations which she revealed to the anchoress in order to establish if there was any deception in them, for the anchoress was an expert in such things and could give good counsel on the matter. Both ladies became foundational in English literary history, as Marjorie wrote what many consider the first autobiographical text in English, and Julian was the first female author of any kind in English whose work survives. One of the messages Julian received from God may be some comfort at the moment. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Blanche Monnier. Blanche Monnier never had any intention of living a life of sequestration. Born into a well-off French family in 1849, she had all the gifts of money and beauty. Unfortunately, she also had the cruelest mother imaginable. In 1874, when she was 25 years old, Blanche announced to her mother that she intended to marry. Her choice of husband, a mere lawyer, did not meet with Madame Monnier's approval. To force Blanche to change her mind, Madame Monnier locked Blanche in a tiny room in the attic of the family home. Blanche's mother and brother continued to live a normal life while Blanche lived in squalor above. Madame Monnier apparently thought that Blanche would relent of her decision to marry after some time alone to think, but she never did. And so her mother never released her. Blanche spent the next 25 years locked in her attic cell. In 1901, an anonymous letter to the authorities revealed Blanche's living conditions, and the home was raided. Blanche was found living in her own filth and weighing little more than 55 pounds 25 kilograms. Her rescuers found the unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed a sort of crust made from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish, and rotten bread. We also saw oyster shells, and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The air was so unbreathable, the odor given off by the room was so rank that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. Blanche was saved from her isolation but remained ill and mentally unbalanced, dying in hospital in 1913. Fernão Lopes. Fernão Lopes, a Portuguese soldier of the 16th century, led a very storied life. Taking part in the conquest of Goa, he was left in charge of the Portuguese garrison. These men soon came under attack and many defected to the enemy. Lopes married a local woman and converted to Islam. When the next Portuguese force arrived, they wreaked brutal retribution on Lopes and others. Lopes was tied up and had his nose, ears, right arm, and left thumb all hacked off. The mutilated Lopes was later offered a pardon by his king, but on the way back to Portugal he jumped ship on the desolate island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. St. Helena was uninhabited, but ships would occasionally visit to pick up fresh water and leave supplies for return journeys. Lopes set up home in a small cave, hiding from ships that passed. When one crew accidentally discovered his home, Lopes got a new, unexpected friend. Then the ship set off, and as she was spreading her sails, a cockerel fell overboard and the waves carried it to the shore, and Lopes caught it and fed it with some rice which they had left behind for him. The chicken lived with Lopes and followed him around. Lopes lived alone for 10 years before returning to Europe. There the Pope granted him forgiveness for converting to Islam and granted him his wish to return to St. Helena. Lopes died there, alone, 20 years later. Simeon Stylites. Modern saints tend to be viewed as those who go out into the community and help others, expressing the supernatural through their heroic efforts to improve people's lives. The criteria for sainthood in the ancient world was often quite different. Early saints renounced this world entirely. One of the ways saints did this was to avoid society as much as possible. Monasteries in the desert allowed similarly minded religious folk to live free from the temptations of the world. For some, though even having others near them was too much, Simeon Stylites made his move towards the divine by literally moving away from the world. He lived for decades on a pole. There was a fashion for Christians living on poles, or stylos, meaning pillar in Greek. Simeon was sent a vision from God at a young age urging him to build a tall pillar. At first he moved to a monastery, but he was expelled for his habit of wearing a rope tightly tied around his waist. This caused the flesh to putrefy and stink, to the annoyance of the other monks. Next he became a hermit on a mountain, but crowds soon came to see the holy man. To escape them he erected his pillar and moved to the top of it for the next 36 years. The sight of a man on a pillar proved too alluring for the crowds, however, and more people came to see him. As the years passed he increased the height of his new home to get further away from the people below. On his death he was immediately proclaimed a saint. Thomas Silverstein. Hence solitary confinement is imposed on a prisoner. It can either be for their protection or the protection of guards and other inmates. It can also be a punishment used to force good behavior. Thomas Silverstein became a legend of the American penal system when he spent the last 36 years of his life locked away alone. Some will say he deserved it, others will feel he was punished in a cruel and unusual manner. He was first put in prison for a robbery that netted him only a few $100s, but once behind bars he was never to be freed. Joining the Aryan Brotherhood of white nationalists in prison, he participated in the murder of other inmates. For this he received additional life sentences. After the murder of a corrections officer, Silverstein was placed in solitary confinement and was to be given no human contact. He was held in a windowless underground cell until released in a prison riot. Once order was restored, Silverstein was placed in solitary confinement again, with minimal room to exercise. A court case was brought on his behalf that what he was undergoing was unconstitutional, but since other prisoners were also placed in solitary confinement, Silverstein's treatment was judged to be legal. He died in 2019, well before his theoretical release date of 2095. Tom Neal. Ost people who ended up trapped on a desert island did so after a shipwreck or marooning by an angry crew. Tom Neal was one of the few who actively pursued isolation by moving to an uninhabited island. He spent a great deal of time in the Navy touring the Pacific Ocean before leaving to explore the islands there more fully. His life changed when he heard tales of an atoll called Suwero. In 1952 he convinced a ship that would be passing Suwero to drop him there with some supplies, and his 2 cats. When local islanders heard about his plans for moving there, they offered their help with equipment and sometimes more. Several women offered to accompany him, but he politely turned down their offers. He stayed on the island for several years, but a bad back forced him to leave to seek treatment. He returned, but when pearl divers began to visit occasionally, the island no longer felt sufficiently distant. He also claimed the predominant reason for leaving was a very simple one. I realized I was getting on, and the prospect of the lonely death did not particularly appeal to me. His attempts to live with others, however, did not last for long. He found many parts of modern life annoying, such as clocks and trousers. In 1967 he returned to Suwero, where he lived for 10 years on his own before stomach cancer led to his death. Modern saints tend to be viewed as those who go out into the community and help others, expressing the supernatural through their heroic efforts to improve people's lives. The criteria for sainthood in the ancient world was often quite different. Early saints renounced this world entirely. One of the ways saints did this was to avoid society as much as possible. Monasteries in the desert allowed similarly minded religious folk to live free from the temptations of the world. For some, though even having others near them was too much, Simeon Stylites made his move towards the divine by literally moving away from the world. He lived for decades on a pole. There was a fashion for Christians living on poles, or stylos, meaning pillar in Greek. Simeon was sent a vision from God at a young age urging him to build a tall pillar. At first he moved to a monastery, but he was expelled for his habit of wearing a rope tightly tied around his waist. This caused the flesh to putrefy and stink, to the annoyance of the other monks. Next he became a hermit on a mountain, but crowds soon came to see the holy man. To escape them he erected his pillar and moved to the top of it for the next 36 years. The sight of a man on a pillar proved too alluring for the crowds, however, and more people came to see him. As the years passed he increased the height of his new home to get further away from the people below. On his death he was immediately proclaimed a saint.